We've already seen how we can test regular assigns, but LiveView also allows us to assign things asynchronously. So I want to go ahead and see how we can test that. Now, if you open up your app, you'll see that we have a metrics live. If you go to that metrics live under /metrics, you'll see that it has a loading indicator, and then we load that little user visits and a metric, in this case 123. I'll go ahead and reload the page to show that again. There we go. So let's go ahead and see how that's implemented. If you go to metrics live, and let's go ahead and take a look at mount, you'll see that we have only one assign, and that's using assign async. And we're doing the metric, and then we're passing the function, and we're calling fetch metric. In fetch metric, we're going to go ahead and ignore this params for now, this test force failure. We're going to look at that in a little bit when we look at some tests. So let's ignore this for now, and by default, we're doing the following. We're just sleeping here, so we're emulating some actual behavior. In your true implementation, you could imagine this being a query that takes a long time or something like that, and that's in fact what I'm trying to emulate here, right? A metric might be some type of calculation, and so maybe it takes a little bit long, and so that's why we're sleeping here. This is just emulating that. Ignore these two for now. We're going to see them in a few tests in a second. But then we return OK. We return the assigns that we're going to merge in, so that's a metric, and the metric has a value, that's a 123, and a name, user visits. Now let's go ahead and look at how we render this. When we render this, if the metric is loading, we're going to render that little skeleton that we saw, and that has a data role of loading, so we're going to target that in our test. Then, if it's not loading and the metric was successful, we're going to go ahead and render the metric result name and the metric result value, and that's all under a data role success. And otherwise, we're going to go ahead and render the failure, which says failed to load and shows that little emoji. Let's go ahead and take a look at how we test this. Open up your test under Ranger Web Live Metrics Live Test. And let's first go ahead and test the loading indicator. So I want to say renders loading indicator when loading. Taking the connection struct, and in this case, let's ignore the view, grab the regular HTML, and mount our LiveView. Since we're loading this page and our loading indicator is just that skeleton, we can't actually assert that there's any text there. So what we'll do is assert by proxy, which we've done before. We're just going to assert that a data role is present, and we're going to call it good enough. So I'll go ahead and assert that HTML, somewhere in that HTML, we have a data role. I'll escape this that has loading. Right. Let's go ahead and run this test. Excellent, it passes. And just to confirm that you're testing what you think you're testing, we can go ahead and delete this data role, rerun the test, and now it should fail. Excellent. So I'll go ahead and put this data role back in there, rerun the test, and now let's go back to our tests. Perfect. So that covers the case for loading, but how do we test that the assign was successfully loaded, right? Let's say renders metric after loading. We'll do similar setup, but in this case, we're actually going to use the view, ignore the HTML. And now what can we do here? Your first inclination might be to do a process sleep. And that's not terrible because we can actually sleep this process for say 2 seconds because we know our hard-coded 1500 milliseconds in the metrics live, once that finishes, we should have the data we want. And so we can do a regular assert has element. Pass in the view, we're going to target a data role success here. And says user visits. Right? So we sleep 2 seconds because, again, I'm going to go to the test. We have a hard-coded 1500 milliseconds here. So I'll go ahead and run this test. Excellent, it passes. Now what happens if you were to do 1 second, so 1000 milliseconds? This should fail, and sure enough it does. So I'll put this back. Now, is this a good test? Not really. It actually leaves a lot to be desired. First of all, this process sleep is a little bit of a code smell. Why? Because it means that we are not able to handle asynchronicity very well. We just have to sleep this process. It's kind of a hard thing to do. But moreover, the other problem is that this will always sleep 2 seconds. suppose our metrics live implementation was actually a query that takes a little bit of time, right? In that case, maybe the query finishes in 500 milliseconds or 800 milliseconds, right? Maybe there's some variability there. But our test is always going to sleep 2 seconds, which is a long time, even if it's not necessary. It would be much nicer if we could instead wait up to 2 seconds, but if the queries resolve faster, then we can actually assert something about the page sooner. And so that's what we want to do. So Phoenix LiveViewTest ships with a render async helper that does basically that. So let's go ahead and see how we can write this. So we could say assert render async, take the view, and now this is going to return just an HTML blob. And here we can just say we want to expect user visits to be present. Now this render async helper by default waits 100 milliseconds. Now we know that's not enough because we've hard-coded at 1500 milliseconds. So we're going to have to pass something more like 2 seconds in order to make sure that the test passes. Let's go ahead and run this, make sure it passes first. Okay, so it passes. Now you might say, why is this better? Because we're still hard coding the 2000 milliseconds. This is better because if the implementation finishes faster than these 2 seconds, then the test will be resolved faster. We are at most waiting 2000 milliseconds. The reason why that is happening is because render async underneath the hood is actually doing a timeout. It's waiting up to 2 seconds. But if the process is resolved sooner, then we're actually going to render the page sooner and we'll actually have the data correctly. So this is better than the last one because we don't always wait 2 seconds. It's still unfortunate that we have to wait that long. But in reality, we have to do that in order to wait for our data to load. Now, the other problem with this that we still have is that this is hard-coded, and it's what we call a mystery guest in a test. We don't know where this value comes from. Think about your future coworkers coming in and looking at this. They have no idea why 2000 milliseconds makes sense here, right? They don't know unless they actually go and look through the metrics live and find some other comparison, right? It would be better if we could somehow declare something about these 2000 milliseconds. And it turns out we can. So let's go ahead and look at the metrics live. One thing we could do is, I'm going to comment this out and uncomment this one, is we could expose a metric timeout, right? And if you look at this here, it's just a function and we're hard coding the 1500 milliseconds. And that's just because of our implementation, right? And in our implementation, we are waiting those 1500 milliseconds. You can imagine having an implementation where that's our timeout. Maybe we're doing some queries and we have that timeout. So maybe we can expose that timeout through a function. But if we do this, now our test can rely on this. So let's go ahead and we'll go back to our test. And we can say the timeout is going to be based on that one. So let's go ahead, Ranger Web, metrics live, metric timeout, right? And so we'll grab that timeout and we'll say, let's use that timeout plus say 100 milliseconds extra, right? Just to make sure for any inter-process communication, any rendering, all that stuff, that we actually wait 100 extra milliseconds. We run this and it passes. The nice thing about this that is better than the last one is that now we don't have that mystery guess, right? Now we know where this timeout is coming from, and it's coming directly from Metrics Live. You can go in there, you can take a look at it. So both the implementation and our test are using the same metrics timeout function, and so we have that compatibility. There's no mystery guest anymore. Now this is one way to do this. There's also another way which relies on application configuration. Let's take a look at it. Let's go ahead and remove that one and now use this config timeout. That config is just calling this function that is using application getenv, ranger module, and we pass a key, right? So we're passing the timeout. So what we're doing is we're pulling from application configuration. Let's take a look at config test. Go to the bottom and you have it right there. We have a timeout set to 1500 milliseconds. And in fact, you could actually make this lower for tests, right? You don't want your test to wait for 1500 milliseconds for no reason. So maybe you have a timeout. Again, maybe your implementation is actually a query and you have a timeout there that's, I don't know, 5 seconds because it's a complicated query. But in test, you don't have to wait that long. So in config test, this could actually be something like 100 milliseconds, right? But for now, let's leave it 1500 milliseconds. That's fine. So I'll go back to the implementation. And as you can see, this is just going to basically render the same thing. It's going to be 1500 milliseconds. And now that's how much we're going to sleep. So if we go back to our test, we can now use the same application configuration in our test. So rather than rely on this metric timeout, we go to application, getEnv, Ranger, and we pull the timeout, right? So I'll go ahead and run this test. And we're going to do the same thing here, by the way. We're just going to add 100 milliseconds just to make sure that we're waiting enough. Excellent, it passes. So this is another way you can do this. You can do it with application configuration, or maybe you find some way of exposing that timeout to your test. Now this covers the successful cases, but how do we test the failure scenario? And now this is kind of difficult because we're dealing once again with asynchronous stuff. So let's go ahead and see one way we can do this. Like the connection struct, we'll do the setup. And we're just going to go ahead and call it render async. In this case, we're going to grab the view. We don't even need to wait a timeout. But what we want to make sure is present is failed to load. Now, how do we make sure that we are failing? Let's save this and then go to our implementation. If you remember in our mount function, I told you to ignore this at the beginning, but now we're going to look at it. We have these params, and in those params, we're passing them to fetch metric. And those params have a test force failure. So basically, we're passing a query param from the test into our LiveView that is going to force us to return an error, right? So we're injecting some data into the test via query params. So let's go ahead and add that here. Metrics, test force failure equals true. And let's run this test. Excellent, it passes. Now, this is one way to do it, but of course it opens you up to potential issues, right? You are actually opening up a set of params in your real LiveView, right? Ideally, you don't have to do this just for your tests, but it is something that sometimes people do, right? You're trying to inject some type of configuration. There are other ways to handle this. For example, you could rely on some application configuration, just like we did here, just a different key. We say, force failure, and up here we fetch that. So only in test do we force failures. And then from your test, you would say application put-env. You set the force failure to true, and then your test could fail that way. Again, this is not ideal necessarily, but it's the only way we can kind of get access into this black box to force a failure. Now, if your implementation is different, you might have a module here in this fetch metric that you can mock, right? In that case, you might not need to do any of these things. You can use mocks or mock one of those libraries and mock your module, make it return a failure, and then you could get your test to do that too. So that's just another way to test those failures. But I hope you can see that LiveView provides us pretty good primitives to test asynchronous assigns, and it gets us pretty far, even if we have to do a couple of things here and there to get the testing of the failure case, and if we have to deal with a little bit of timeouts. Happy testing.